In late February 1999, a 13-year-old girl left her Bronx home and did not return. Within days, her disappearance would lead police into one of the borough's most troubling investigations. What began as a missing child report soon became a crime scene inquiry that would remain unresolved for decades. Evidence was collected, interviews were conducted, and attention focused on individuals in her neighborhood, yet no arrest followed. Years passed, technology changed, and preserved material would eventually speak where witnesses could not. If you value careful, evidence-based reporting on long, unsolved investigations, consider subscribing and staying with this channel as we continue to examine how time and science reshape justice. Minerliz Soriano lived with her family in the Bronx and attended school in the area. On February 24, 1999, she left her residence and failed to return home. When she did not come back, concern grew quickly. Family members reported her missing, and the New York Police Department began an active search. Officers canvassed nearby streets, checked common gathering areas, and questioned individuals who might have seen her. At that stage, authorities were treating the situation as a missing child investigation, moving with urgency while still uncertain about what had occurred. Local reporting at the time described heightened anxiety in the neighborhood. Flyers were distributed and information requests were made to the public. Detectives sought to reconstruct her last known movements, focusing on the area surrounding her home and nearby residential complexes. Co-op City, a large housing development in the northeast Bronx, became central to the search effort as officers worked to determine where she had last been seen. On February 28, 1999, 4 days after she disappeared, her body was discovered inside a garbage bin in Co-op City. The recovery shifted the investigation immediately. Medical examination determined that she had been strangled. Law enforcement publicly confirmed that her death was the result of a violent criminal act. The missing person inquiry was now a murder investigation. Detectives secured the location where she was found and began documenting physical evidence. Forensic personnel processed the area, collecting biological material and other items deemed potentially relevant. Authorities also revisited earlier interviews and expanded canvassing efforts. Anyone who had contact with Minerliz in the days before her death was re-examined. The focus turned toward individuals known to frequent the neighborhood, including men who interacted with young residents. At that time, DNA technology was available but limited compared to later advancements. Investigators preserved biological evidence recovered from the scene and from the victim's clothing. Samples were submitted for laboratory testing. Detectives compared findings against available databases and examined potential suspects known to law enforcement. Despite these efforts, no immediate match was identified. Public concern remained high. The age of the victim and the proximity of the crime to residential housing intensified scrutiny. Community members demanded accountability and information. Law enforcement officials acknowledged the gravity of the crime and emphasized that the investigation would continue until answers were found. By the end of 1999, the investigation had generated interviews, laboratory testing, and suspect review. Yet no arrest had been made. Evidence remained in custody. Files were retained. The case would remain open, sustained by preserved material and the expectation that future developments in forensic science might provide clarity that was not yet possible. On February 28, 1999, 4 days after Minerliz Soriano had been reported missing, sanitation workers in Co-op City made a discovery inside a garbage dumpster that shifted the investigation from a missing child search to a confirmed violent crime. Her body was found discarded among refuse in a residential area of the Bronx. Emergency responders and patrol officers secured the location immediately. The area surrounding the container was cordoned off as detectives and crime scene technicians began formal documentation. Investigators confirmed the identity through available information and notified family members. Medical examination at the scene indicated that the death was not accidental. Visible injuries were consistent with violent assault. The body was transported for autopsy, where the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner conducted a full forensic evaluation. Authorities later confirmed that Minerliz had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Those findings were documented in medical reports and would form the foundation of the criminal inquiry. Crime scene specialists photographed the container, surrounding pavement, and any potential transfer evidence. Clothing and personal effects were carefully collected. Swabs and trace materials were preserved according to laboratory standards in place at the time. Detectives worked to determine whether the location where she was discovered was the primary crime scene or a secondary disposal site. The condition of the remains suggested that the fatal assault occurred elsewhere and that the body had been transported. Officers canvassed the immediate vicinity, knocking on doors and asking residents about unusual activity during the previous days. The housing development was densely populated, and investigators attempted to reconstruct movements around the dumpster area between February 24th and February 28th. Witness accounts were logged and compared for consistency. Sanitation schedules were reviewed to establish when the container had last been emptied. The autopsy provided critical information regarding cause of death and time frame. Medical examiners concluded that strangulation was the cause. Evidence of sexual assault was documented clinically and preserved through biological sampling. That material would later become central to the long-term investigation. At the time, detectives prioritized isolating potential suspects who had access to the area and opportunity during the window between disappearance and recovery. Public communication shifted after the discovery. The NYPD confirmed that a homicide investigation was underway and urged community members to come forward with information. The victim's age intensified concern among residents. Law enforcement presence in the neighborhood increased as canvassing continued. Flyers were distributed and tip lines emphasized. Investigators also retraced Minerliz's last known movements. She had been seen near her home days earlier. Detectives examined whether she had entered a vehicle voluntarily or been forced. Without surveillance footage in the area, the inquiry depended heavily on witness memory and physical evidence. Officers evaluated whether anyone had been seen speaking with her before she vanished. All collected materials were submitted to the appropriate forensic laboratories. Biological samples were cataloged and prepared for DNA testing. In 1999, the combined DNA index system was operational, but still expanding. Profiles could be entered and compared, though database breadth was more limited than in later years. Detectives awaited laboratory results while continuing interviews and background checks. The discovery in Co-op City marked the beginning of a homicide investigation grounded in physical evidence. The early response established preservation of biological material, confirmation of violent death, and documentation of the disposal location. These foundational steps would shape the direction of the inquiry in the months and years that followed. In the days following the discovery in Co-op City, detectives intensified efforts to identify who was responsible. With biological material secured and the medical examiner having confirmed sexual assault and strangulation, investigators turned to reconstructing Minerliz Soriano's final movements. Officers mapped her known locations on February 24, 1999, the afternoon she disappeared. They interviewed family members, classmates, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen her walking through the residential complex. Detectives sought clarity on whether she had been lured, followed, or forced. Attention quickly focused on individuals who spent time near public spaces in the neighborhood. Officers reviewed prior complaints, past arrests, and informal community concerns involving men who interacted frequently with children. Among those noted was a local figure later referred to in media reporting as Jupiter Joe. He was known in the area for offering informal astronomy lessons and speaking with young people about space. Detectives documented his proximity to the location where Minerliz had last been seen and assessed whether he had prior contact with her. investigators questioned numerous residents as part of a broad canvass. They revisited building lobbies, playgrounds, and walkways where the victim had passed. Witnesses described seeing Minerliz near her home earlier that day. Detectives compared those statements with known movements of potential persons of interest. Although suspicions developed, no direct evidence at that time connected any individual conclusively to the crime. Laboratory analysis of the recovered biological material produced a male DNA profile. That genetic information was entered into available law enforcement databases. In 1999, the combined DNA index system contained far fewer profiles than in later decades. When the DNA was run through state and national systems, no match was identified. Without a database hit, investigators could not attribute the genetic material to a known offender. Detectives examined whether the perpetrator may have lived in or visited Co-op City. They looked at employment records and past criminal histories of individuals residing nearby. Background checks were conducted on those who had prior arrests for violent or sexual offenses. Interviews continued, but no probable cause emerged to support an arrest. Officers were required to rely on corroborated facts rather than suspicion. Community concern remained high. The murder of a 13-year-old girl within a residential complex intensified public pressure. Law enforcement officials assured residents that the inquiry was active and ongoing. Detectives continued to review physical evidence, hoping advances in forensic science or new information from the public might yield progress. During this phase, investigators evaluated whether the disposal site was connected to the perpetrator. They assessed whether someone familiar with sanitation schedules could have chosen the dumpster deliberately. They examined access points and pedestrian routes leading to that location. Despite extensive canvassing, no eyewitness identified a person placing a body inside the container. The absence of a DNA match created a significant limitation. Without a confirmed identity tied to the biological sample, detectives lacked the evidentiary basis for prosecution. Officers preserved the genetic profile in anticipation that future database expansion might produce a result. The sample remained cataloged under secure storage protocols. Over time, leads diminished. Interviews that initially appeared promising did not produce corroborating proof. The investigative file grew as reports were compiled and re-examined. Although suspicion towards certain individuals persisted, the legal standard required verifiable evidence linking a suspect to the crime scene. That threshold had not yet been reached. The early investigation established critical groundwork. Detectives identified persons of interest, documented forensic findings, and preserved biological evidence with the expectation that science might one day provide clarity. In 1999, however, available tools could not bridge the gap between suspicion and proof. The inquiry would remain unresolved for years, anchored by a DNA profile waiting for technological advancement and a match that had not yet appeared. As detectives pursued leads across the Bronx, laboratory work continued behind the scenes. The biological material recovered from Minerliz Soriano's clothing and body was submitted for forensic testing under the protocols available in 1999. Analysts extracted a male DNA profile from the preserved samples. That genetic information represented the most objective piece of evidence in the investigation. Unlike witness accounts or circumstantial observations, the DNA profile was measurable and distinct. It offered the possibility of identifying the person responsible, but only if a corresponding profile existed within law enforcement databases. At the time, the combined DNA index system was operational but still developing. Many states were in the early stages of collecting and uploading profiles from convicted offenders. The number of stored samples was far smaller than it would become in later years. When the male genetic profile from the evidence was entered into state and national systems, no match appeared. The absence of a database hit did not invalidate the evidence. It simply meant that the contributor had either never been convicted of a qualifying offense requiring DNA submission, or his sample had not yet been uploaded. Forensic scientists documented the profile carefully and preserved the remaining biological material. Standard practice required maintaining chain of custody records to ensure that the evidence could be relied upon in court if a suspect was later identified. Storage conditions were controlled to prevent degradation. Although the technology of the era could generate a usable profile, it could not extend beyond existing database entries. Investigators understood that limitation clearly. The evidence was valuable, but it was constrained by the reach of available records. Detectives evaluated whether any identified persons of interest could be compelled to provide a DNA sample. In the absence of probable cause, they could not legally obtain biological material through force or court order. Suspicion alone did not meet the constitutional threshold. Without a match from CODIS and without independent evidence directly linking a suspect to the crime scene, prosecutors could not proceed. The investigation therefore remained open but without a prosecutable defendant. The medical examiner's findings had already confirmed strangulation as the cause of death and documented sexual assault through clinical examination. Swabs taken during autopsy formed the basis of the DNA profile. Those samples were retained under evidence protocols with long-term storage in mind. Detectives recognized that advances in forensic science were occurring steadily. While the tools in 1999 had limits, preservation created the possibility of future testing using improved techniques. Investigators revisited the laboratory results periodically. They ensured that the profile remained active within the system so that any new entry could be automatically compared. As years passed and more convicted offenders were required to submit DNA, the database expanded. Each addition increased the likelihood that a match might eventually occur. However, no direct hit emerged during the early years after the crime. The forensic process of the late 1990s required careful balancing of scientific promise and legal restraint. The evidence identified a male contributor, but it did not provide a name. Without that identity, the prosecution could not establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Detectives continued to maintain the biological material in secure storage, preserving its integrity against environmental degradation. In parallel, officers reviewed whether emerging techniques such as partial profile analysis or additional laboratory methods might yield further detail. Reporting from the time indicates that standard procedures were followed, but no expanded identification could be achieved through conventional database comparison. The profile remained a silent record of the perpetrator's presence, preserved in evidence lockers and digital systems. The scientific limitations of the era shaped the direction of the inquiry. Detectives had secured strong physical proof linking an unknown male to the assault, yet technology could not translate that data into a person. The investigation therefore rested in a holding pattern. The DNA profile existed, documented and preserved, waiting for either a database match or a future method capable of bridging the gap between genetic code and individual identity. As months passed without a database match, the investigation gradually shifted from active pursuit to long-term maintenance. Detectives had interviewed witnesses, documented forensic findings, and entered the male DNA profile into national systems. When no direct identification emerged, the inquiry slowed. The case remained open within NYPD records, but daily investigative activity decreased. Officers reassigned to new incidents retained responsibility for preserving the file and ensuring that evidence remained intact. The biological material collected in 1999 was stored under controlled conditions designed to prevent degradation. Chain of custody documentation accompanied each item. Swabs, clothing, and related materials were cataloged within property rooms and forensic facilities. The integrity of those samples depended on consistent administrative oversight. Laboratory protocols required periodic verification that stored evidence had not been compromised. Those safeguards allowed the preserved DNA to remain viable decades later. Investigative files were also maintained in physical and digital formats. Reports, witness statements, medical examiner findings, and laboratory summaries were archived according to departmental standards. Although no suspect had been charged, the existence of an identified male DNA contributor meant the case could not be closed as unsolved without potential for future action. The genetic profile stayed active within the combined DNA index system, automatically checked against new entries as the database expanded. During the early 2000s, New York law enforcement agencies continued to collect DNA from convicted offenders under state mandates. Each addition increased the size of the searchable database. Detectives understood that the individual responsible for Minerliz Soriano's death might eventually enter the system for an unrelated offense. If that occurred, the stored profile could generate an alert. Until then, progress depended on patience. Community memory did not fade as quickly as investigative momentum. Residents of the Bronx remembered the loss of a 13-year-old girl whose body had been discarded in a residential dumpster. Media coverage resurfaced periodically, especially on anniversaries. Those reports reminded the public that the investigation remained open. Detectives reviewed tips that surfaced over the years, though none produced sufficient evidence for prosecution. Administratively, cold cases require structured oversight. Supervisors ensure that evidence remains preserved and that digital records are accessible for future review. In Minerliz's case, preserved biological material became the most important asset. Without it, advances in forensic science would later have been meaningless. The decision to retain those samples under proper conditions reflected an understanding that technology evolves. As scientific methods advanced nationally, law enforcement agencies began exploring expanded DNA techniques. However, during much of the early 21st century, New York's use of familial DNA searching was limited and governed by policy considerations. The Soriano investigation remained dependent on the original genetic profile and the hope of a database match. The years of relative inactivity did not represent abandonment. Rather, they reflected the constraints of available tools. Detectives could not compel new testing without legal authority or scientific innovation. The preserved evidence waited within secure storage, cataloged and protected. That preservation would later prove essential when technological changes offered a new investigative path, allowing the dormant genetic profile to become active again in a different scientific landscape. By the second decade of the 21st century, forensic science had developed beyond what was available when Minerliz Soriano was killed. DNA databases had expanded substantially, and laboratories were able to analyze genetic material with greater sensitivity and precision. Profiles that once produced no direct matches could now be examined through additional methods. Among the most significant changes was the development of familial DNA searching, a technique designed to identify potential relatives of an unknown contributor when an exact database match was absent. In New York, the use of familial DNA was governed by defined procedures. Authorities could not deploy the method casually. Policy required that traditional investigative strategies had been exhausted and that the biological evidence met quality standards. Oversight mechanisms were implemented to address privacy concerns and ensure that searches were conducted responsibly. The technique relied on statistical comparison of shared genetic markers. Instead of identifying a single identical profile, analysts evaluated partial similarities that could indicate close kinship, such as a parent-child or sibling relationship. Cold case units within the NYPD began reviewing older investigations that contained unidentified DNA. The preserved profile connected to the Soriano investigation remained viable within the system. Although it had not produced a direct hit in earlier database comparisons, advances in analytical software and expanded offender records increased the potential for new results. Detectives reassessed the case file, confirming that the biological material collected in 1999 had been maintained without compromise. Chain of custody documentation remained intact, preserving the evidentiary value of the sample. After internal review and authorization under state guidelines, a familial search was conducted. Analysts compared the unknown male profile against the database to identify partial genetic correspondences. The results indicated a close relative of the contributor had submitted DNA for an unrelated matter. That finding did not provide a suspect name immediately. It generated a family line. Investigators then examined public records and genealogical data to determine which relatives could plausibly have been present in the Bronx in February 1999. Detectives compiled names associated with the familial link and narrowed the list by age, residence history, and documented presence near Co-op City. Background information was evaluated carefully. The goal was to identify an individual who matched both the genetic indication and the geographic circumstances of the original crime. Through this process, Joseph Martinez became a person of interest. Records showed he had lived in proximity to the neighborhood at the relevant time. Before proceeding further, investigators required direct confirmation. Familial searching alone does not establish guilt. It identifies investigative leads that must be corroborated. Authorities obtained a DNA sample associated with Martinez through lawful means. That sample was submitted for comparison against the preserved 1999 evidence. Laboratory analysis demonstrated that the genetic markers were consistent across both profiles. The male DNA recovered from Minerliz's body and clothing matched Martinez conclusively. The confirmation represented the first time in more than 2 decades that the unidentified profile had been attributed to a specific person. For detectives who had maintained the file, the result marked a significant development grounded in scientific procedure rather than assumption. The evidence that once existed only as a numeric genetic sequence now had a name attached through verified laboratory comparison. Officials later noted that the use of familial DNA in this investigation reflected broader changes in forensic capability within the state. Policy adjustments had allowed careful application of the method under judicial oversight. The Soriano investigation became one of the early examples in New York City where familial searching played a central role in identifying a suspect in a long unresolved case. The emergence of this technology did not alter the foundational evidence collected in 1999. Instead, it allowed that preserved material to be interpreted through expanded analytical tools. Without the decision to maintain biological samples and digital records, the opportunity to apply familial DNA would not have existed. The breakthrough was therefore tied not only to scientific progress, but also to evidence retention practices that spanned decades. With a confirmed genetic match, investigators moved from dormant review to active preparation for arrest. The identification of Joseph Martinez shifted the investigation into a new legal phase, supported by documented laboratory findings and procedural compliance. The DNA profile that had once stood alone in the database now provided the basis for formal criminal charges, transforming years of uncertainty into actionable evidence grounded in modern forensic science. The confirmation of a familial DNA lead marked a turning point in the long investigation. Once analysts identified a partial genetic connection within the state database, detectives began the careful process of narrowing the possible relatives. Familial searching does not deliver a single name, it provides a network. Investigators had to determine which individual within that network could have been present in the Bronx in February 1999 and could plausibly be the contributor of the biological material recovered from Minerliz Soriano. Records review became central to that effort. Detectives examined residential histories, age ranges, employment information, and prior contacts with law enforcement. They compared timelines to establish who among the relatives linked by DNA had lived near Co-op City at the time of the crime. Through that review, Joseph Martinez emerged as a viable candidate. Documentation indicated he had been in the area during the relevant period. Investigators assessed whether his age and background aligned with the circumstances documented in 1999. At that stage, the inquiry remained confidential. Familial DNA leads require corroboration before any public action is taken. Detectives needed a direct DNA sample from Martinez in order to confirm whether he was the source of the preserved profile. Law enforcement obtained that sample through lawful investigative means. Once collected, the specimen was submitted to the laboratory for comparison against the genetic material retained since 1999. Forensic analysts conducted a side-by-side evaluation of the two profiles. The process involved comparing multiple genetic loci to determine whether they were consistent across both samples. The results demonstrated a conclusive match. The male DNA recovered from the victim's clothing and body corresponded to Joseph Martinez. The statistical probability of the profile belonging to another unrelated individual was extremely low. With that confirmation, detectives had objective scientific evidence linking Martinez directly to the biological evidence recovered at the time of the crime. The identification transformed the investigation from a cold file into an active criminal proceeding. Detectives compiled laboratory reports, chain of custody documentation, and genealogical analysis supporting the familial search. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence to ensure that the procedures used complied with New York law. The application of familial DNA had been conducted under state guidelines, and the confirmatory test relied on standard direct comparison methods recognized in court. Authorities then prepared for arrest. In 2021, Joseph Martinez was taken into custody and charged in connection with the 1999 killing of Minerliz Soriano. The Bronx District Attorney's Office announced that the identification had been made possible through familial DNA technology. Officials emphasized that the preserved biological evidence had remained intact for more than 2 decades, enabling modern forensic tools to establish the link. Following his arrest, Martinez was indicted by a grand jury on charges that included second-degree murder. The indictment reflected the evidence obtained through laboratory comparison and investigative review. Prosecutors outlined that the genetic material recovered at the time of the crime matched Martinez conclusively. The genetic identification provided the evidentiary foundation for moving forward with prosecution after more than 20 years without a named suspect. The identification also prompted renewed attention to the case within the Bronx community. Reporting highlighted that the arrest stemmed from technological advancement rather than newly discovered witness testimony. Law enforcement officials noted that the investigation demonstrated how preserved evidence could become decisive when scientific capability evolved. Defense counsel later examined the familial DNA process during pre-trial proceedings. However, at the stage of identification and arrest, the key development was the laboratory match. Detectives had moved from a partial familial link to a direct genetic confirmation. The evidentiary standard shifted from investigative lead to prosecutable proof. The identification of Joseph Martinez did not erase the years during which the investigation remained unresolved. Instead, it illustrated how long-term evidence retention and expanded database capacity intersected. The genetic profile created in 1999 had remained unchanged. What evolved was the analytical framework used to interpret it. Once matched to Martinez, the preserved DNA became central to the prosecution's case. With arrest and indictment complete, the matter progressed toward formal court proceedings. The scientific work that began with a preserved swab in 1999 had culminated in a named defendant. The investigation, which once relied on suspicion without proof, now rested on documented laboratory findings linking Joseph Martinez directly to the biological evidence collected at the time of the crime. Following the laboratory confirmation that the preserved DNA matched Joseph Martinez, law enforcement moved to formalize the case through established legal procedures. In 2021, Martinez was arrested in connection with the 1999 killing of Minerliz Soriano. Authorities announced that the arrest was based on familial DNA analysis, followed by direct genetic comparison. The Bronx District Attorney's Office stated that the evidence provided a scientific link between Martinez and the biological material collected at the crime scene more than 2 decades earlier. After the arrest, the matter proceeded to grand jury review. Prosecutors presented forensic findings, chain of custody documentation, and investigative summaries detailing how the familial search had led to Martinez's identification. The grand jury returned an indictment charging him with 2 counts of second-degree murder. Those charges reflected both intentional murder and felony murder theories under New York law, grounded in the evidence that the victim had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The indictment marked the first formal criminal accusation in the case since 1999. Court records documented that Martinez was arraigned and entered a plea of not guilty. Bail and detention issues were addressed according to standard procedure. The case was assigned to a trial court in the Bronx, where pretrial motions would later shape the admissibility of the forensic evidence. Prosecutors emphasized that the preserved DNA profile had been entered into the combined DNA index system and remained unmatched for years until familial searching was approved. They outlined that once a partial match to a relative was identified, investigators lawfully obtained Martinez's DNA for direct comparison. The laboratory confirmation provided the evidentiary basis for the charges. Officials described the arrest as an example of how evolving forensic tools could reopen investigations once constrained by database limitations. Defense counsel signaled intent to examine the methods used in the familial search process. Legal scrutiny focused on whether the procedures complied with state guidelines and constitutional protections. However, at the stage of indictment, the court recognized that probable cause had been established through the genetic match and supporting investigative work. Public reporting highlighted that the arrest occurred more than 20 years after the crime. The Bronx community, which had long remembered the killing of a 13-year-old girl, learned that a suspect had finally been charged. The district attorney's office released statements acknowledging the role of technological advancement and the persistence of detectives who maintained the evidence. Court proceedings moved forward with scheduling of hearings and motions. Prosecutors prepared to present expert testimony explaining DNA analysis, statistical probability, and the familial search framework. The indictment documents reflected that the charges were supported by both the genetic findings and the original medical examiner's conclusions regarding cause of death and sexual assault. The formal charging of Joseph Martinez transformed the case from a cold investigation into an active prosecution. The legal system now had a defendant, an indictment, and documented forensic proof linking him to the biological evidence. What had once been an unidentified DNA profile stored in evidence lockers became the centerpiece of criminal proceedings in Bronx Supreme Court. The arrest and indictment represented a procedural milestone rather than a final resolution. Guilt would need to be established in court through admissible evidence and judicial review. Nonetheless, the transition from preserved sample to named defendant marked a decisive shift. The case advanced from scientific identification to formal legal accountability, anchored by documented laboratory comparison and grand jury action that allowed prosecution to proceed after decades of uncertainty. Following indictment, the prosecution and defense entered a prolonged period of pretrial litigation that focused heavily on the admissibility of familial DNA evidence. The charges against Joseph Martinez were grounded primarily in genetic identification, supported by the preserved biological material collected in 1999 and the confirmatory comparison conducted more than 2 decades later. Because familial searching was still relatively new within New York, its legal foundation became a central issue before trial. Defense counsel challenged the investigative process used to identify Martinez. Motions questioned whether the familial DNA search complied fully with state policy and constitutional safeguards. Attorneys examined how the partial match was generated, what oversight procedures were followed, and whether the method introduced potential bias. They argued that jurors should scrutinize not only the final DNA comparison, but also the pathway that led detectives to Martinez's identity. Prosecutors responded by outlining the regulatory framework governing familial searches in New York. They explained that authorization had been obtained under state guidelines and that the initial partial match was treated solely as an investigative lead. The confirmatory test, they emphasized, relied on standard direct DNA comparison between Martinez's sample and the preserved evidence from the victim. That comparison involved analysis of multiple genetic markers and produced a statistically significant match. According to the prosecution, the familial search narrowed the field, but the direct laboratory result established evidentiary reliability. The court conducted hearings to determine whether the DNA evidence would be admitted at trial. Expert witnesses were prepared to explain genetic analysis, database expansion, and statistical probability. Judges evaluated whether the scientific principles underlying familial searching were generally accepted within the forensic community. These proceedings required careful consideration, because the outcome would influence not only the Soriano prosecution but also future applications of familial DNA in New York courts. In addition to DNA-related motions, defense attorneys examined other aspects of the case. They explored the timeline between 1999 and the arrest, questioning whether investigative delay had affected evidence preservation or witness availability. Prosecutors maintained that the preserved biological material had been stored under controlled conditions and that chain of custody documentation demonstrated integrity. The longevity of the evidence became part of the narrative presented in court, highlighting both the passage of time and the continuity of record-keeping. Media coverage during the pre-trial stage reflected public interest in the use of familial DNA technology. Reports described the method as an investigative tool capable of identifying suspects through relatives in the database. At the same time, legal commentators noted privacy concerns and the need for strict oversight. The Soriano prosecution became one of the more prominent examples of the technique within New York City. Throughout these proceedings, the court focused on procedural compliance. The admissibility question centered on whether the genetic evidence met established standards for reliability and relevance. Prosecutors provided laboratory reports detailing the number of loci examined and the statistical rarity of the matching profile. Defense counsel scrutinized methodology and documentation. The adversarial process ensured that the scientific evidence would be tested before being presented to a jury. The pre-trial phase extended over multiple court appearances, reflecting the complexity of the issues involved. Judges issued rulings that allowed the prosecution to introduce DNA findings at trial, subject to cross-examination and expert testimony. Those rulings signaled that the court found the scientific foundation sufficient for jury consideration. By the time trial preparation concluded, both sides had outlined their positions clearly. The prosecution would rely heavily on the genetic match linking Martinez to the preserved biological evidence. The defense would challenge the process that led to his identification and seek to raise doubt regarding reliability. The legal debate underscored the broader implications of applying evolving forensic technology to crimes committed decades earlier. As the case moved toward jury selection, the pre-trial proceedings had established the parameters of the dispute. The preserved DNA profile, once an unidentified sequence within a database, had become the focal point of constitutional argument and scientific testimony. The court's rulings cleared the way for trial, where jurors would ultimately evaluate whether the evidence proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. When the trial began in Bronx Supreme Court, the focus shifted from investigative reconstruction to formal proof presented before a jury. Prosecutors carried the burden of establishing that Joseph Martinez was responsible for the death of Minerliz Soriano in February 1999. More than 2 decades had passed, yet the preserved biological evidence collected at the crime scene remained central to the proceeding. The courtroom became the setting where scientific testimony, historical documentations, and witness recollection were placed under structured examination. The prosecution opened its case by outlining the sequence of events, beginning with Minerliz's disappearance and ending with the recovery of her body in a dumpster in Co-op City. Medical findings from 1999 were introduced through documentation and expert explanation. The autopsy had determined that she died from asphyxiation and that there was evidence of sexual assault. These findings were presented in clinical, factual language consistent with court standards. The emphasis remained on documented injuries and cause of death, without embellishment. Prosecutors sought to show that the violent acts were intentional and deliberate. Attention then turned to the preservation of physical evidence. Jurors were informed that biological material had been recovered from the victim's clothing and body during the original investigation. Laboratory technicians described how those samples were cataloged and stored in accordance with departmental protocols. Over time, as forensic technology advanced, the samples were retested. The resulting DNA profile was entered into state and national databases but did not produce an immediate direct match in 1999. Expert witnesses explained how familial DNA searching later generated a partial match to a relative of Martinez. The court heard testimony about the methodology used in such searches. Analysts described the examination of genetic markers at multiple loci and the statistical probability associated with a match. Prosecutors emphasized that the familial result served only as an investigative lead. To confirm identity, investigators obtained a direct DNA sample from Martinez after surveillance and lawful collection procedures. That sample was compared against the preserved biological profile from 1999. According to laboratory testimony, the comparison showed a match with an extremely high degree of statistical certainty. The prosecution also presented evidence regarding Martinez's proximity to the area in 1999 and his presence within the Bronx community at that time. Investigators described earlier questioning conducted during the original inquiry. Although no arrest had occurred then, records confirmed that Martinez had been known locally and was later referred to by the nickname Jupiter Joe because of his interest in astronomy. That background was introduced to provide context for prior investigative attention, not as character evidence unrelated to the charges. Defense counsel challenged the reliability of familial DNA procedures and questioned whether the scientific process could produce false associations. Cross-examination focused on database expansion, laboratory oversight, and the interpretation of statistical probabilities. Defense attorneys also raised concerns regarding the passage of time and whether delay might have compromised memory or documentation. They argued that jurors must evaluate whether the prosecution's reliance on genetic evidence alone met the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors responded by reiterating that the confirmatory test was not speculative. It was a direct comparison between Martinez's DNA and the preserved biological profile recovered from the victim. Expert witnesses testified that the probability of another unrelated individual matching the profile was extraordinarily small. The statistical calculations were explained in plain terms for juror comprehension. The scientific evidence was presented as objective data rather than inference. Throughout the trial, the court maintained procedural boundaries. Evidence unrelated to the charged offenses was excluded. References to sexual abuse were limited strictly to the documented medical findings that supported the charges. The presentation avoided emotional framing and remained anchored to records and laboratory reports. The judge instructed jurors on the elements required for conviction, including intent and causation. As testimony concluded, both sides summarized their positions. The prosecution argued that preserved biological material, analyzed with modern techniques, provided conclusive identification. The defense urged caution regarding emerging forensic methods and stressed the importance of certainty. Jurors were tasked with weighing scientific testimony alongside historical documentation. Deliberations followed after closing instructions. The trial had translated decades of investigation into structured legal argument. Genetic science, once unavailable in 1999, had become the primary evidentiary pillar. The proceeding illustrated how advances in forensic methodology can reshape dormant investigations when preserved material remains intact. Ultimately, the responsibility rested with the jury to determine whether the evidence established Martinez's guilt under the law. After days of testimony and legal argument, jurors in Bronx Supreme Court began deliberations with detailed instructions from the bench. They were directed to evaluate the elements of second-degree murder under New York law and to determine whether the prosecution had proven each requirement beyond a reasonable doubt. The focus centered on intent, causation, and the credibility of the forensic evidence presented during trial. Decades had passed since Minerliz Soriano was killed, yet the legal standard remained unchanged. The responsibility rested entirely with the 12 individuals reviewing the evidence inside the jury room. When deliberations concluded in 2025, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 2 counts of second-degree murder against Joseph Martinez. The decision followed structured review of the preserved biological material, expert testimony regarding DNA analysis, and medical findings documented in 1999. Court reporting and the Bronx District Attorney's Office confirmed that jurors accepted the reliability of the confirmatory DNA match obtained after familial searching identified a genetic link to a relative. The verdict reflected acceptance of the scientific evidence as persuasive and legally sufficient. The courtroom reaction was recorded through official statements rather than emotional description. Prosecutors emphasized that the conviction resulted from long-term preservation of biological evidence and the application of modern forensic methods. the Bronx district attorney issued a formal statement acknowledging the decades-long investigation and recognizing the work of detectives who revisited the file after advances in DNA technology became available. The statement focused on accountability and institutional persistence rather than celebration. It noted that Minerliz had been 13 years old when she was killed and that her family had waited many years for legal resolution. Defense counsel preserved objections for appellate review and signaled intent to challenge aspects of the proceedings. As is standard in serious felony cases, sentencing was scheduled for a later date following post-verdict motions. The conviction did not immediately conclude the judicial process. Under New York law, defendants retain the right to appeal on grounds including evidentiary rulings, procedural decisions, and constitutional arguments. Those avenues remain separate from the jury's factual findings. During post-verdict commentary, prosecutors clarified that the conviction rested heavily on the direct DNA comparison rather than solely on the initial familial search. The familial process served as an investigatory tool that guided detectives toward Martinez. The confirmatory laboratory match provided the evidentiary foundation introduced at trial. Experts reiterated that the statistical probability of an unrelated individual sharing the same genetic profile was extremely low. Jurors were instructed on how to interpret those probabilities within the framework of reasonable doubt. The court also addressed the charges connected to sexual assault. As presented during trial, medical testimony had established evidence consistent with sexual abuse at the time of death. Those findings formed part of the factual basis supporting the murder counts. They were discussed in clinical language without reenactment or elaboration. The verdict encompassed the full scope of the indictment as authorized by the grand jury. Public communication from law enforcement emphasized the investigatory arc that led to conviction. Officials described the case as the first in New York City to be solved through familial DNA searching that resulted in trial and conviction. That development reflected changes in policy allowing such searches under regulated conditions. The outcome was presented as an example of how preserved material and evolved in scientific standards can interact within established legal safeguards. For the Soriano family, the verdict marked formal recognition by the justice system. Court coverage reported their presence during proceedings, though official statements focused primarily on procedural facts. The conviction did not alter the loss sustained in 1999, yet it provided a judicial finding based on evidence examined under oath. The legal record now included a definitive determination of responsibility. Sentencing proceedings were set to follow in accordance with statutory requirements for second-degree murder convictions. Under New York law, such convictions carry significant penalties, including lengthy prison terms. The court would later impose sentence consistent with applicable guidelines and judicial discretion. That phase would conclude the trial court's involvement, subject to any appellate review. The guilty verdict demonstrated the intersection of patient evidence preservation, technological development, and structured courtroom scrutiny. The process extended across more than 2 decades, beginning with crime scene documentation and culminating in jury deliberation. The legal outcome was the product of accumulated investigatory effort rather than sudden discovery. In the formal record of Bronx Supreme Court, the 1999 killing of Minerliz Soriano was no longer an unresolved file. It had been adjudicated through a verdict delivered after careful examination of scientific proof and procedural safeguards. The conviction in Bronx Supreme Court did more than resolve a long unresolved killing. It placed New York City's use of familial DNA searching under public examination and judicial review. Officials described the investigation as the first in the city to move from a familial genetic lead to arrest, indictment, trial, and guilty verdict. That sequence required coordination between detectives, forensic laboratories, prosecutors, and policymakers who had established guidelines governing how such searches could be used. Familial DNA analysis differs from direct database matching. Instead of identifying an exact profile already stored in a criminal index, it searches for close biological relationships when no direct match exists. In New York, the technique operates within a regulatory framework that limits its use to serious crimes and requires internal authorization. Reporting on the Soriano investigation explained that preserved biological material from 1999 was compared against the state DNA database. When no direct hit occurred, investigators pursued a familial search that identified a relative whose profile suggested a close genetic connection to the unknown perpetrator. That process did not itself establish guilt. It generated a lead that required independent confirmation. The impact of the conviction reinforced the importance of preserving evidence for extended periods. Detectives in 1999 could not rely on familial searching because the method did not yet exist. The biological material recovered during the original investigation was nonetheless retained in controlled conditions. Without that preservation, later technological advances would have had no practical effect. The investigation demonstrated that careful storage, documentation, and chain of custody procedures can sustain the viability of evidence across decades. Legal oversight also played a defining role. Defense counsel challenged aspects of the genetic methodology before trial. Courts evaluated admissibility under established standards that require scientific techniques to be sufficiently reliable and accepted within the relevant community. The judicial rulings permitting introduction of the DNA evidence affirmed that the methods used met those standards. That scrutiny underscored that technological progress alone is insufficient without procedural safeguards. Public discussion surrounding the verdict included debate about privacy and the reach of genetic databases. Familial searching implicates relatives who themselves are not accused of crimes. New York's framework limits access to convicted offender databases and requires documented approval before conducting such searches. The Soriano investigation became a reference point for how those limits function in practice. Officials emphasized that the familiar component identified a potential direction, while the confirmatory sample taken directly from Martinez provided the evidentiary basis presented to the jury. For prosecutors, the outcome illustrated the value of revisiting cold investigations with disciplined review rather than assumption. Detectives reopened the file with awareness that earlier inquiries had not produced sufficient proof for arrest. Instead of discarding prior work, they integrated preserved materials into new forensic strategies. That measured approach avoided speculation and relied on verifiable laboratory results. For law enforcement agencies, the case highlighted institutional memory. Personnel may retire, units may reorganize, and priorities may shift, yet archived records and physical evidence can maintain continuity. Administrative systems that track and catalog preserved items ensured that materials remained accessible when policy permitted renewed analysis. The conviction also reaffirmed that delayed justice must still satisfy contemporary standards of proof. Jurors in 2025 evaluated evidence from 1999 through the lens of current law. The passage of time did not reduce the prosecution's burden. The verdict therefore reflected confidence in both the scientific procedures and the courtroom process used to present them. From an educational perspective, the investigation demonstrates how evolving forensic methods can intersect with long-standing legal principles. Evidence retention, regulated database searches, confirmatory testing, and judicial review functioned together rather than independently. The institutional lesson is not about speed, but about structure. Advances in genetics can assist investigations, yet accountability depends on adherence to defined safeguards and transparent courtroom evaluation. Minerliz Soriano's killing occurred in February 1999. The legal resolution arrived more than 20 years later through a method unavailable at the time of her death. The record now reflects how preservation, regulation, and methodical review converged to produce a conviction. The broader significance lies in demonstrating that investigative persistence, guided by policy and scientific validation, can transform dormant evidence into legally tested proof while maintaining constitutional boundaries.